He stood on the glass balcony of his penthouse, the city lights like scattered coins below, and the rain had left the glass with a million tiny smiles. Alexander Hayes held his whiskey like a medal and watched the world he had bought reflect and fracture in the liquid. At 38, he had made fortunes, closed deals that rewrote skylines, and learned to treat risk like a commodity. Pride kept him awake. Control kept him awake. Tonight, there was a dare that hummed louder than the neon. In a private room 3 floors below, a laugh and a challenge awaited him, and the stake was not a building or a stock, but something that felt dangerous because it threatened the very thing he counted on most, his certainty that he could shape anyone into what he wanted. The challenge arrived in the voice of Marcus Reed, an old friend and an enemy who knew the exact pressure points of Alexander's ego. Marcus proposed a wager so cold and precise that Alexander smiled before he even heard the terms. Marry someone who would not be impressed by wealth, not as a stunt, but as a genuine union, and remain married for 6 months, living as a married couple. Win and extract not just a sum of money, but a public declaration of dominance. Lose and accept a humiliation broadcast among their circle for a lifetime. $5 million was only the dessert. The real prize was proof. Marcus had already selected the person he thought would prove the point, a woman who lived on the other side of the neat lines Alexander drew in the city map. Emma Ruiz worked at a community center in a neighborhood that smelled of frying plantains and laundry soap, not champagne. She had a laugh that shook her shoulders, cheeks that reddened when embarrassed, and a body that history called overweight, and she carried like a shield, and sometimes like a story. When Alexander agreed, it was a ripple in a glass castle, a signed contract that felt both ridiculous and intoxicating. He thought it would be a game. He thought he would win, because he did not understand that what you can purchase with cash, you cannot buy with presence. He did not expect how a single look could unsettle his assumptions. The first time he saw Emma, she stood in the doorway of the small community cafe where they had agreed to meet, hair pulled into a loose knot, wearing a worn denim jacket and a smile that did not ask permission. The smell of coffee and fried dough cut through the air. She sat down without fluffing a dress or practicing a laugh. Before anyone could explain, she said, "I know why you are here," and then folded her hands on the table as if signing a contract in a different language. The room seemed to tighten. People walking by slowed. This was not about money. This was about what happens when the man who thinks nothing can surprise him meets someone who cares about people more than appearance. In 6 months, everything would be rearranged. Alexander's world had always balanced on the architecture of certainty. His office in the tower had leather chairs that smelled like old victories, a bronze globe with cities that he had touched, and a secretary named Clara Bennett who could recite his schedule without the need for a calendar. He had allies like Rachel Fields, who handled PR and smoothed reputations, and rivals like Marcus Reed, who smiled in places that hurt him later. Alexander's upbringing was a collage of privilege and a vacuum of affection. His father, Victor Hayes, built an empire and taught Alexander to measure worth by net worth. His mother left when he was young, and the silence of that absence taught him to conquer public spaces to fill private emptiness. He was brilliant at numbers and ruthless at negotiation, and when a problem was not a balance sheet, he hired people to reduce it to one. That habit made him efficient, terrifying, and alone. Emma's life was the opposite, a web of small demands and loud laughter. She grew up with her abuela in a 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery where the smell of cinnamon became comfort. She became a community organizer because the world she knew did not have room for bystanders. She was 31, and her body bore the marks of living a life where food was both pleasure and heritage. Her kindness was practical. She knew names, allergies, birthdays, and which children needed a coat. Her backstory was rich in quiet endurance. A mother who worked nights, a brother who left for military service and came back with a limp, and a string of boyfriends who mistook tolerance for interest and left when things got heavy. Emma carried a secret heart problem that she had minimized out of fear that a diagnosis would become a sentence. She had learned to laugh because life required it more than it required explanations. The contrast between the two lives was not merely material, it was structural, like two different languages with a fragile bridge between them. The wager was formalized in a lawyer's office with leather chairs that contrasted with the floral curtains of Emma's community center. Marcus waited with a smile like a razor. Clara Bennett placed a witness pen on the contract, and Rachel Fields took discreet photographs that would later be useful as proof or publicity. Emma signed with a steady hand and asked only one question. "Are we expected to pretend?" Alexander grinned, because when you can buy people, you can buy their truth, he thought. He said, "We will live as a married couple. We will share a bedroom, a kitchen. You will know my life, and I will know yours. If 6 months end and you remain unimpressed, I will hand over 50,000 to the cup and praise you for being incorruptible." Emma agreed because there was a promise hidden in the absurdity, a chance to use resources for programs that needed repairs, a chance to show the young women she mentored that love could be chosen with eyes open. The first days were ceremonial. Photographs were taken for the registry, with Marcus smirking in the background, and Daniel Park, the wedding photographer, capturing smiles that sometimes felt rehearsed. Mateo Rivera from the center brought a bouquet that smelled faintly of gardenias and embarrassment. The city watched as Alexander Hayes transported himself into a smaller life, and as Emma walked into spaces where chandeliers and power lunches had names they had not earned. The community reacted with curiosity and suspicion. Some, like Mateo, cheered. Others, like Carmen Ortiz, whispered that this was a circus. Their first nights together were maps of unknown rooms. Alexander's penthouse smelled like cedar and clean money, and Emma's pajamas smelled like lavender and takeout. She cooked a simple stew one night that smelled of cumin and tomatoes, and Alexander found himself asking for seconds, as if the food could answer questions it was not designed to answer. They bickered about chores and television and how to fold a fitted sheet. There were small humiliations for Emma, like a patronizing gift from a friend, and for Alexander, like tripping on a rug in front of young interns. There were moments when Alexander expected applause for simple kindness, and instead found silence. A key scene unfolded at a charity gala organized in part by Rachel Fields, where Emma, in a borrowed dress, went unnoticed, except by a few of the volunteers she had once taught to speak up. Alexander stood in a room that smelled of perfume and candle wax, and someone called him over and praised his generosity, as if that act alone could redeem a lifetime of absence. Emma watched from the edges because the gala was a theater of status, and she was backstage. In a tense conversation at the gala, Alexander said, "Why do you not smile for me like the others do?" And Emma replied, "I do not perform to make you comfortable." The exchange was brief but dense with implication. Around them, perfume, clinking glasses, and the hum of a string quartet created a sensory layer that made everything feel both more polished and more brittle. This was domestic life turned public, and every small friction amplified. 2 moments of tension grew. One, when a gift meant to cement Alexander's social standing, reminded Emma of a past hurt, and she walked out into a cold night with the sound of heels on wet pavement. And the other, when a tabloid article suggested the marriage was a publicity stunt, and Alexander lashed out at Emma at breakfast, words sharp as knives that cut the veneers of both their lives. These scenes showed that different worlds could collide not only with energy, but with hurt. Then the secret surfaced in an ordinary way. Emma fainted in the middle of a volunteer meeting at the center, her face turned pale and her hands fluttering like trapped birds. The smell of disinfectant and the echo of concerned voices created a corridor into a hospital, where the lights were clinical and the air had the sterile sweetness of antiseptic. Alexander felt something like fear for the first time that was not a calculation. He felt the raw possibility of losing control. In the emergency room, Dr. Sophia Kim took the lead. She had a calm voice that sketched diagnoses in clear lines. The initial tests revealed irregularities in Emma's heart rhythm and an enlarged heart chamber, suggesting a cardiomyopathy that had been living quietly under years of strain. The medical exposition that followed needed precision, so the team spoke plainly to provide both clarity and authority. Dr. Sophia Kim explained that Emma's condition required immediate monitoring, a series of tests including an echocardiogram and Holter monitoring, and that lifestyle changes and a supervised rehabilitation plan would be essential. In 3 clear paragraphs that described procedures in a technical but accessible way, the team outlined a treatment plan. They would schedule an echocardiogram to image the heart's structure and function. They would use a 24-hour Holter monitor to detect arrhythmias. If necessary, medication such as a beta blocker could be prescribed to control heart rate and reduce workload. In case of significant heart failure symptoms, a referral to a specialized cardiomyopathy clinic would be arranged. The specifics were a lifeline, but also a threshold. They fit into a neat 300-character explanation for the viewers who wanted to know the facts. The hospital corridor smelled of cold coffee and paper, and Alexander sat on a vinyl chair, feeling the hum of machines as if it were his own pulse. The stakes had shifted in a single fainting spell. The wager was no longer a performance. If Emma's life was at risk, then anything that had been a game required a human response. That night, inside the small hospital room where the fluorescent light was too honest, Emma and Alexander had their first long conversation that was not colored by bravado. It began with a question from Alexander that sounded like an order. "I will pay for the best care. Full stop." Emma looked at him with an expression that balanced gratitude and pride and said, "I want to do this my way." Alexander hesitated, not used to being told that money alone could not fix a heart or mend a history. Over 12 exchanges, they argued about control, trust, fear, and the way the world saw Emma. She said, "You keep treating me like a problem." And he said, "I'm trying to protect you." And she replied, "Protection feels like possession sometimes." They spoke about childhoods, about hunger, about loneliness. They spoke about Marcus's challenge and how it had become a dangerous shape. The sensory details in the room were vivid, the beeps of the monitor like a distant metronome, the antiseptic smell, the scratch of a pen on chart paper, the warmth of a shared cup of tea that seemed too small to hold such heavy talk. Over the course of that night, both of them realized the wager had forced an intimacy that might have taken years to build otherwise. It forced them to face fears, and in facing them, they made the first real promise not written in any contract. Alexander promised to be present in ways that did not feel like transactions. Emma promised to let help in, not as surrender, but as strategy. The treatment plan became real and prosaic and human at once. Alexander hired a team as if he were assembling a corporate board, but this board had different credentials. Dr. Sophia Kim coordinated care. Nurse Olivia Grant checked vitals with a gentle efficiency and taught Emma to track symptoms. Ava Lewis, the nutritionist, created a sustainable eating plan that honored cultural foodways while promoting heart health. Daniel Park, the physical trainer, designed a rehabilitation regimen that began with walking and gentle movement and slowly increased with patience. Clara Bennett rearranged schedules and found a tutor for the center's kids during appointments. Rachel Fields managed communications so the tabloids would not exploit vulnerability for headlines. Each professional brought technical skill and human compassion, and the process scenes were detailed. An echocardiogram room with the cold gel on the skin, the low whir of the machine translating muscle into image. A training session at dawn where dew smelled fresh and sneakers hit pavement. And a kitchen table where Emma learned to measure oil with a spoon rather than a cup. The technical elements of monitoring and medication, when described, remained accessible yet precise, so the audience could trust the plan without feeling overwhelmed. The course was not linear.
There were nights when medication made Emma dizzy, and nights when progress felt like a slow, stubborn plant unfurling leaf by leaf. There were setbacks, a missed appointment due to an emergency at the center, a flare of anxiety that made sleep run away like a frightened animal. There were also small victories, the first comfortable night of sleep in months, a blood pressure reading that showed small improvement, a conversation with Matteo where he called Emma his anchor. Alexander himself changed his routines. He attended appointments, learned to fold gauze into a neat square, sat in waiting rooms for hours reading pamphlets about heart health. He started to understand that commitment was not a signature, but a sequence of small acts. As the months passed, social reactions shifted. At first, friends like Rachel Fields and Clara Bennett had teased Alexander about his experiment. Then they began to notice subtle changes, a gentleness in his emails, a reduced appetite for late-night deals. The community that had watched with suspicion began to see a man who no longer only offered donations for photo ops, but showed up in person at food drives, lifting boxes with calloused hands that were not built for heavy lifting, but tried anyway. News outlets wrote stories that traced a narrative from stunt to sincerity. Marcus Reed kept his smile, but eyes that tracked the slow erosion of his certainty. Emma's glow-up was not a cosmetic transformation. It was the result of rigorous care, reclaimed dignity, and the discovery of options she had never known she deserved. She lost some weight, yes, but more importantly, her posture changed, her voice strengthened, and her laugh gained time. At a gala that Alexander attended months later, not as a trophy but as a supporter of the center, people who had once whispered now stood and applauded. In one emotionally charged scene, Alexander stood to give a speech. He had the scent of cologne and sweat, a quiet nervousness behind his practiced public speaking tone. He said, "I came here to win a bet, and I leave with something I could not have purchased." The room smelled of polished wood and perfume, and the applause sounded like relief. Yet there was also skepticism. Some members of the old social circle accused Emma of being coached, offered explanations that fitted the old script of manipulation. The textured reactions of the community were named Matteo Rivera, who cheered, Carmen Ortiz, who remained wary, Daniel Park, who offered measured congratulations, Rachel Fields, who adjusted PR but watched with maternal protectiveness, Clara Bennett, who wiped her eyes discreetly, Ava Lewis, who smiled like a colleague proud of work well done, and Nurse Olivia Grant, who hugged Emma like family. But a crisis returned as unpredictability always attends life. A routine check uncovered a dangerous arrhythmia that required a quick decision. Emma collapsed at home, the room filled with the smell of hospital disinfectant hours later and the metallic tang of fear. This emergency compressed everything into a single hinge point. Alexander sat in an antiseptic waiting room with hands clenched so tight his knuckles were pale, and his breath worked against a depth of dread he had not known could exist. The doctors deliberated whether to implant a cardiac device that could correct deadly rhythms. The choice was invasive and real, and pushed both of them into a place where marriage contracts and wagers meant nothing. They faced the choice together, and they chose life. Emma underwent a procedure and awoke in the recovery room to the soft voice of Dr. Sophia Kim explaining the anatomy of risk and the anatomy of hope. This episode lasted for a short, intense time, with 2 paragraphs of clinical detail describing the device purpose, the implantation under local anesthesia, and the follow-up plan. A clear but compact explanation for those seeking understanding. The moment had a tension of 500 to 600 characters each in emotional weight, the kind that makes everything else raw and small. After the surgery, the rehabilitation intensified, and with it a deeper bond. Alexander read aloud to Emma while she convalesced, sometimes tripping over the warmth of the act. He asked uncomfortable questions about the years he had missed, and she named quiet hurts. They had arguments about what was public and what deserved privacy. At one point, in a scene dense with dialogue made of 12 exchanges, Emma said, "Why would you ever think this is a game?" And Alexander said, "I did not know how else to start." She replied, "Then do not make my life your scoreboard." And he said, "I am learning to keep score in different ways." They moved through apologies and small rituals that became essential rituals, like making tea at midnight or checking medication together. The center grew into a base of operation for community clinics, and Alexander opened an account for a fund named after Emma's abuela. The reactions of friends and critics turned toward admiration, but not uncritical admiration, rather a grudging respect that sometimes whispered envy. The final crisis developed as the 6-month mark approached. Marcus Reed attempted a public reveal, claiming that Alexander had manipulated data to win, that gratitude had been purchased. A viral article questioned Emma's autonomy and asked whether her community had been bought. The article spread like spilled oil, and for a moment, the fragile progress trembled. Alexander could have retreated into denial or paid for silence, but he chose confrontation. He stood in front of a television camera and answered not as a businessman, but as a man who had learned how to be afraid and how to care. He apologized for the wager openly and then offered a new proposal. He asked Emma in front of cameras and community members whether she would marry him, not because of a bet, but because of a choice. The scene was tense, the lights hot, the crowd breathing in a hush. Emma hesitated and then said yes, not to please him, but because she wanted to build something real and because she had seen, in small, consistent acts, that he was learning to be present. The words 3 short sentences had gravity. The moment worked like a hinge, the past opened to a future. The decision was not an ending, but a commitment to continue the work they had begun together. The months after their decision were not a fairy tale, but a practice in ordinary compassion. Alexander created a foundation providing heart health screenings in low-income neighborhoods. He put actual governance in place, a board that included Mateo Rivera, Dr. Sophia Kim, Ava Lewis, and Emma herself. They ran a summer program that taught young people about nutritious cooking that honored family recipes. They renovated the community center's clinic and hired nurse Olivia Grant as its coordinator. Claire Bennett coordinated volunteer events, and Daniel Park created a community fitness program that met in the park every morning with the sound of children's
Laughter and sneakers on gravel. The foundation was not merely a PR vehicle, it was a structure that invited accountability and included transparent audits and community representation. The public narrative shifted into something more complex and more real. Alexander learned to listen to meetings that were not about quarterly profit, but about whether a local family could get a ride to a hospital. Emma led support groups that taught people how to advocate for healthcare, and she wrote op-eds about dignity and care. Their work changed how people around them thought about responsibility and generosity. 1 month after the surgery, Emma led a small clinic that screened 30 people, and the clinic smelled like coffee and hope. She walked with a steady step, and the scar on her chest was a map of survival. She and Alexander spent afternoons building a scholarship fund for local students. 3 months later, they announced a partnership with a cardiac research center that included funding for a community-based study on lifestyle and heart health. The researchers, led by Dr. Lee, published preliminary findings that suggested community interventions could improve markers of heart health in small but significant ways, and the center received attention for combining medical rigor with social care. 6 months into their life together, the center held a celebration where families they had helped spoke publicly. The longer epilogue included small images, like a child receiving a winter coat, an old woman finally getting a diagnostic referral, and the center's after-school program growing to twice its size. In 5 years, the foundation had funded hundreds of screenings, supported dozens of research placements, and Emma and Alexander were parents to a child who brought new rhythms into their lives. The epilogue tracked progress like a slow bloom, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and then a 5-year look that showed sustainable change and legacy building. Through the months, Alexander became less a man of transactions and more a man of presence. He learned the vocabulary of patience. He learned to say, "I am sorry," without attaching it to profit. Emma learned that accepting help did not erase her agency. They both learned the tension of reconciling a life begun by chance and a life chosen on purpose. The community reacted with complexity. People like Carmen Ortiz, who had been skeptical, now praised their consistent work. Mateo stayed loyal and kept insisting on community oversight. Marcus Reed faded from the narrative like a storm past. Rachel Fields adapted by telling stories that focused on impact rather than spectacle. Nurse Olivia Grant and Dr. Sophia Kim became fixtures in the foundation, and Ava Lewis wrote a manual on culturally sensitive nutrition that became a resource for other centers. The final moments were small and intimate. Alexander watched Emma rock their child in a sunlit room while the smell of baby lotion and warm bread filled the air. He remembered the glass balcony where the city had glittered like coins, and now saw instead a kitchen table with a stack of bills waiting and a plate half-eaten. He had entered a wager to prove something to himself and walked out with a new ledger, a balance sheet that listed presence, patience, and repair. The foundation bore their name, but more importantly, it bore their promise, that resources could be allocated with humility and that healing required both science and sustained human contact. In a quiet sentence that closed the story, Alexander said, "I thought I would win a bet, but I learned how to be loved in a way I did not know I needed." Emma replied, "You taught me to accept help when it is honest and to refuse help when it feels like a performance." If you are feeling anger at the idea of a bet, or if you are moved by a slow redemption, you are not alone. What would you do if someone made a wager about your life? Would you take the resources and run the risk of being used, or would you negotiate terms that protect dignity and purpose? Write "surrender," or tell us in a few words, would you forgive a manipulation if it led to tangible help? Your comment might comfort someone who has been used, or encourage someone weighing a hard decision. We read every comment, and the conversation you start helps others scale the same walls. Now let us return to the scene where it all shifted from game to care and see how one fainting changed 2 lives and a whole neighborhood. This story is not about a magical glow-up as a cosmetic makeover. It is about medical reality, about a diagnosis that required attention, and about 2 people who chose, imperfectly and bravely, to transform a bet into a life. The lessons are practical. Early detection matters. Community interventions matter. Honest philanthropy matters. When procedural details appear, they were handled by specialists with credentials and clear plans. Dr. Sophia Kim coordinated diagnostic imaging, arrhythmia monitoring, medication management with beta blockers when indicated, and access to device therapy when life-threatening rhythms appeared. The team ensured follow-up appointments, cardiac rehabilitation, and nutritional counseling to address root causes, not cosmetic symptoms. There were many secondary characters along the way, each with a named role and action, who shaped the arc. Marta Alvarez, a longtime volunteer, ran the after-school program and organized the first clinic. Mateo Rivera advocated funding and delivered boxes of food. Carmen Ortiz represented the neighborhood association and demanded accountability at every board meeting. Daniel Park led community fitness classes and coached teenagers. Nurse Olivia Grant provided patient education and follow-up calls at night. Rachel Fields managed public communication and protected privacy. Clara Bennett managed logistics and found tutors. Ava Lewis designed menus and led cooking classes that honored family recipes while introducing healthier techniques. Each of them changed their small corner of the world, and in doing so, made the change sustainable. In the end, the man who thought winning meant being right discovered winning meant being useful. He discovered that humility can be learned, and that love sometimes arrives wrapped in service and inconvenient truth. The woman who was once the subject of a wager reclaimed her narrative and built institutions that outlasted gossip. The community that watched learned to ask for more than spectacle. It asked for systems that worked. If this story touched you, subscribe for more narratives about people whose lives were altered by difficult choices and steady work. Share this with someone who believes in second chances or who needs proof that help can come with dignity. Sometimes losing a bet is the beginning of winning a life.